Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. We imagine and try to help bring about, with your support and commitment, a more just, caring, and loving world on this show. Most Americans have probably been taught that their legal system is basically a positive reflection of what the majority of citizens consider to be fair and just. Lady Justice, while imperfect, is blind to racial and class differences, and all will have a relatively fair shake in the system. However, many people's real-life experiences are quite different, especially those experiences of the poor, people of color, working people, the disenfranchised, and those for a variety of reasons who are or have been negatively marginalized in this society. Law as a system of enforceable rules governing social relations and legislated by a political system is often existentially felt by these people as a political ideology that often oppresses, exploits, humiliates, and tries to shame them. The system exists for them to confirm a certain political viewpoint and serve the interests of the rich and powerful. My guest today on the Radical Imagination is the past president of the New York chapter and member of the executive committee of the oldest and most extensive network of public interest and human rights activists working within the legal system, the National Lawyers Guild. The Guild was founded in 1937 as an association of progressive lawyers and jurists who believed that they had a major role to play in the reconstruction of legal values to emphasize human rights over property rights. I experienced that idealism and imaginative commitment firsthand through the first major stop and frisk trial in the city 4 years ago. Marty Stolar was the brilliant and articulate lead lawyer that defended us and helped change the narrative on stop and frisk in this city and around the country. I'm so glad that he's here on the show today to offer his expertise and the humanity to help us understand the tragic and many, many important criminal justice cases and issues the city and country is faced with. So welcome, Marty, to the Radical Imagination.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you so much for being
Appreciate
here.
it. I'm glad to be here.
Great, great. So tell us a little bit, how did you get involved with the Guild? What were some of the personal, intellectual experiences that you had that led you to this involvement?
When I graduated from law school in 1968, I was still only 25 years old and subject to the draft. And I was determined not to go to Vietnam. And I considered going to Canada and considered doing any number of other things, and ultimately wound up becoming a VISTA.
Yeah,
VISTA
Volunteers for
was an
America.
old program, Volunteers in Service to America,
Yes.
what is now considered AmeriCorps.
Mm-hmm.
And my draft board decided that that was an occupation that was vital to the national interest and gave me a deferment for a year. So I spent a year in Columbus, Ohio, being involved in legal education. It's a very complicated process by which we got to Columbus, but I wasn't allowed to practice law there because of various restrictions that were put on the agency that sponsored us to come to Columbus. Anyway, when I came back to New York in 1969 and started training and working as a legal services lawyer, I was a Reginald Heber Smith Community Lawyer Fellow, and I was assigned to work in Bedford-Stuyvesant in the Bedford-Stuyvesant Legal Services Program. And I had met during the training some of the Lawyers Guild lawyers from the West Coast and the East Coast who I had not had much contact with before. And they were concerned about the war in Vietnam, and they were concerned about civil rights issues. And here was a training program for legal services lawyers, which was primarily concerned with housing and welfare and government benefits programs. And it was like a breath of fresh air, that here was some radical political ideas that were being brought in to bear on mundane, day-to-day legal services work. And legal services was, in many ways, a sop to a community which had been disenfranchised. But in any event, that's when I ran into guild folks. And when I came back to New York, I became involved with the Mass Defense Committee. Now, the Mass Defense Committee had been created in 1968 in response to the rebellion at Columbia University, where hundreds of students were brutally arrested. And the Guild responded to that by creating an office that dealt with the mass defense of a mass arrest. In many ways, Mary Kaufman, who was an old founding member of the Lawyers Guild, had been a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, was our mainstay in New York, and she took a number of young lawyers, such as myself, and trained us in how to do criminal defense of people involved in political activity who get arrested for that. And that was my introduction to the Guild. I became one of the young lawyers who worked with the Mass Defense Committee and basically started doing criminal defense as part of the Mass Defense Committee, so that my very first criminal trials ever were demonstration cases.
Right.
Two young men who had been arrested when Nixon came to town. They were protesting outside the Hilton Hotel about the war in Vietnam. And they got arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, and they became my cases. And I went to trial with them. They were demonstrators, and it was great. Both of them, however, got convicted. I was shocked to find out that police officers would lie their teeth out and make things up for things that didn't happen. In any event, that was the beginning of my career as a criminal defense lawyer. Started out representing demonstrators, and I've been doing that ever since.
And the word you used there is interesting, as they were brutally arrested. And
there was a certain amount of physical force. They didn't get beat up, because if they'd gotten beat up, they would have been charged with assaulting a police officer.
Right.
So they were only charged with disorderly conduct, which means that either they were annoying somebody.
But the police were very aggressive.
The police were extraordinarily aggressive.
And I happened to have been, I didn't meet you at the time, but I happened to have been in those buildings at that time.
Right.
The occupation, and you're absolutely right. They did very aggressively try to remove people. And
Very aggressive.
So
that's where the Mass Defense
Yeah,
Committee began, and that began my association with the Lawyers Guild in New York City. And that rapidly developed into my actually doing a criminal practice. That's how I decided I was going to make a living. I was going to be a criminal defense lawyer. It was one way to fight the state, and because obviously the state is the prosecutor and the aggressor in every criminal case that exists, whether it's a political case or whether it's a straight-up bank robbery.
by definition.
By definition. So I was going to fight the state, at least by being a criminal defense lawyer. That I could use that skill in providing representation to people who were political and people who got arrested as a result of their political activity was really very satisfying to me. Here was something I could do with my law degree that turned out to be of benefit to a movement for radical social change, a movement that had in its heart an anti-capitalist sentiment, that was very supportive and very conscious of racial divides and the racism that pervades the entire legal system, particularly the criminal justice system, and the inequality of income, the way that income is disparately distributed in our society.
But there's a big gap you've got to fill in for us. I mean, this is not taught to you, taught to the typical law student, right?
No.
No.
Definitely not.
So how did you become conscious, or how was this transition, this transformation of you, how did this happen?
Well, personally, my own personal background
Right.
was a very liberal background. My grandparents were, my mother's father was an organizer of the ILGWU. He was an old union guy. In later years, I found out that he was on the side that kicked the communists out of the union. But so union politics and labor politics were always part of my growing up. So I was a good liberal all the way through law school.
You grew up in New York?
I grew up in Rochester, New York.
Okay, I
and
see.
went to high school there and went to college there.
Okay.
And then, but I always come down to New York City because my grandparents lived in New York. So the city was not unknown to me. And then when I came down here for law school and hung out with my grandmother and my grandparents, so I had good liberal leanings towards that. But it was actually when I joined Vista after graduating in 1968, and our training, the Vista training for the Midwest region where I was assigned, was to be in Chicago in August of 1968. And so I happened to be in Chicago in August of '68, where the Democratic National Convention took place, where what developed was a bunch of demonstrations developed into a police riot. I was not there as a demonstrator. I was there basically to be trained as a Vista lawyer, but it turned out I got chased and gassed just as much as the demonstrators was. It was an extraordinary radicalizing event.
I was going to say,
because of my appearance, because my sideburns might have been a little bit longer or my hair was a little frizzy. I got chased by the police, treated like a piece of garbage, not arrested, but I had a revelation as to how the state's forces of power can come down on people who are otherwise defenseless, and nobody cares, particularly in Chicago. So I couldn't wait to get out of Chicago. It was an extraordinary radicalizing moment, and the first place that came up to be assigned to was Columbus, Ohio. That's why I went to Columbus, Ohio, because get me out of Chicago.
Yeah.
But in any event, that was an extraordinarily radicalizing event in my life. Being chased and gassed was no fun. And seeing the way the Chicago police operated and seeing the way the Democratic convention just went forward without a blink in the eye. Nobody cared. The powers that be really didn't give a damn about what was happening to people on the streets who were being bloodied and brutalized and arrested. And I learned a lot.
And the police was that naked force.
Total naked
that you could
force.
really begin to identify.
I have this image of every Chicago police officer being a fat white male.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing that I ran faster than the fat white male did, so I avoided getting arrested. In any event, with that kind of radicalizing experience, when we went to Columbus, Ohio, the housing they found for us was housing in a public housing project. So myself and my friends lived in a public housing project. We were the only white guys living in a public housing project that was predominantly African American residents. And I learned a lot in my 19th year of education about racism and about the way the system works. So by the time I came back to New York City in 1969, I was like a classic radical lawyer ready to do something with the law degree that I had to try to make some kind of a difference, try to make some kind of a dent in society. And the Lawyers Guild was the major outlet for doing that, at least before I joined what was known as the Law Commune. The Law Commune was the new left version of how to practice law. It was a collective where there was a lack of hierarchy among the professionalism. Everybody who was part of the commune, lawyers, law students, and legal workers, had an equal vote in what cases we took. People were paid according to need. And we tried to do as much as we could in terms of generally we'd meet once a week, we'd decide what cases we wanted to take and how we wanted to handle it. And at the largest, there are probably about 20 people involved.
How did you all get together? I'm not sure how this all got formed.
Well, the Law Commune was formed in 1969.
Okay, by
Carol Lefcourt, Bill Crane, Fred Cohn, and Ann Garfinkel. It was later joined by Jerry Lefcourt as a lawyer, Steve Sandler, and myself, and Veronica Kraft, who was at the time my wife, sort of my girlfriend from law school.
I see.
And she became the mother of my two children. And so the two of us were together at the Law Commune,
Right.
which was reflective of everything that was going on in the New Left. That was a way to practice law and say we want to dedicate what we're doing to doing political work. So, for example, the Panther 21 case was a commune case. Nobody charged any fees for that.
And what was the connections with the guild, with the collective?
Well, because the guild, remember, the guild is like a bar association.
Okay.
All right? It's a radical bar association. It's primarily for, at the time, it was only for lawyers.
I see. Okay.
And one thing you forgot to mention when in your introduction, the guild was set up in 1937 as a counterpart to the American Bar Association. The American Bar Association would not admit Negroes.
Right.
And
Or
the
support
guild,
the New Deal, right?
all right, and the New Deal, and so the guild set up and said, of course, that's ridiculous.
Right.
So we're going to be a national bar association that has a mixed race base, that has membership open to all, and that was one of the founding aspects of the guild. And so through the 30s and the 40s, the guild did a tremendous amount of labor support with labor unions, with the craft unions and the trade unions. And some of the older guild members did that, and a lot of them did a lot of labor law. And you know, the guild tried to be around as a positive political force on the left. Then it got pretty much devastated during the Red Scares of the 50s, where the national membership was greatly reduced.
Came down hard on you.
It came down, well,
Not
certainly
just
before my time.
Right.
You know, by then I was in grammar school or in high school, getting lessons in how to duck and cover under my desk to avoid radiation from the nuclear holocaust that was about to come down on us. Something that I think framed a lot of the backgrounds of people of our generation.
No, I meant at the collective there.
Yeah.
As
So,
well.
but so the collective was a way to practice law.
Right.
That's how we practice law and you join bar associations if you're a lawyer. Right? You can join the New York State Bar, you can join the Columbian Bar, you can join the Women's Bar, and you can join the ABA. Right? The American Bar Association did not represent me, did not represent any of the interests and the ideas that I thought were attractive, but the Guild did. Here was a group of radical lawyers. Some of the old generation were probably old communists and old labor lawyers. And here we are, we're the new young generation.
Part of the New Left.
The New Left, coming in with different ideas, but you know, certainly progressive ideas about how to transform society and how to make differences that made a difference in civil rights aspect, and particularly the war in Vietnam, which was a major influence on all of our lives.
What were
back
some
in
of the
that
cases that you were involved with?
Well, back in then, the commune did the Panther 21 case, which was the indictment of the leadership of the Black Panther Party in Manhattan for an alleged conspiracy. The trial took 9 months, and the jury took 90 minutes to find them all not guilty. That was one of our cases. There were some white radical people who were accused of setting off bombs at various banks. Included among those defendants was a fellow named Sam Melville, and who ultimately was convicted and went to Attica and was killed in Attica in 1971. The commune did that too. Through the commune, I became involved with the Catholic left, and
Berrigan Brothers.
the Berrigan Brothers. But my one of my first federal trials was the trial of the Camden 28. The Camden 28 were 28 activists in Camden, New Jersey, who decided to break into a draft board and rip up the draft records as a way of protesting the war in Vietnam. The Catholic left and the Berrigans, if you recall, had engaged in a number of what they called standby actions. That is, they'd go in, they'd bring the draft records out, and they'd burn them, and they'd stand and wait to get arrested. Right? This group decided, no, we're going to go destroy the records, and we're not going to get arrested. So in the middle of the night, they decided to do a burglary of the draft shop in the post office building in Camden, New Jersey. Unfortunately, there had been an informer put into the group, and waiting for them were the police and the FBI. And so ultimately, all of them were arrested. 28 were indicted for conspiracy to destroy government property, and they piled up charges that people were looking at like 35 or 40 years in jail. It's interesting. They had promised the informer that because he was informing on his local parish priest who had gotten himself involved with the folks who were going to do this break-in, they said, look, we'll stop it before it goes anyplace. Don't worry, your friend will be just fine. Well, they didn't stop it. They let it actually go ahead. They let it go forward so that the charges could pile up and so they could go to the defendants who were arrested and say, look, you're facing 40 years in jail. Now tell us who did the burglary in Media, Pennsylvania, where the FBI files were stolen, which were the first time that we understood what COINTELPRO was. They thought that some of the members of the Camden 28 had been involved in the media burglary or knew the people who were involved in the media burglary, so they wanted to up the charges so they could squeeze the defendants to get somebody to talk. Obviously, that did not work. All right? So we went to trial in that case in Camden, New Jersey, and it became the political trial of the 20th century. By the time we did 3.5 months worth of trial in that case, 17 defendants went to trial. There were 3 lawyers in the case. I was one of them. All the defendants were either pro se, which means they represented themselves, or they were co-counsel with one of the lawyers. We did an amazing effort to put the war in Vietnam on trial. Convinced the judge to allow us to bring in Phil Berrigan, who could talk about civil resistance and disobedience. And we brought in everybody's favorite historian, right? Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was a witness at the trial, and Howard was able to give the jury testimony about how the war in Vietnam was really not about liberation. It wasn't about anti-communist anything. It was about tin, rubber, and oil, about capitalist concerns of capitalist America.
So it's very unusual to bring these sorts of themes, these larger economic political themes, into a trial like this.
It was extraordinary. It was
I
extraordinary.
think it needs to be emphasized.
I mean, it had never been done before.
Right.
And we were able to convince the judge to let us do that. And
put the government on
we
notice
put the
in a
government on
sense.
trial.
On trial.
We put the war in Vietnam on trial. We told the jurors essentially that they could nullify the law. That even if they thought the defendants were guilty, if they thought the war in Vietnam was wrong, they could acquit people.
a criminal war.
Criminal
It was
war.
unjust,
I mean,
undeclared.
ultimately, after 3.5 months, the jury acquitted everybody.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah,
We talked to them afterwards. About half the jurors bought the notion that the war in Vietnam was wrong and they were not going to go with it. And the other half of the jurors who had been convinced that that was the case heard in the judge's charge something about outrageous government misconduct that allowed them to say not guilty. It was an extraordinary trial.
Absolutely.
There's now a film about it. It's called The Trial of the Camden 28. But it was really one of my major hallmarks as a lawyer. It was a pleasure to be able to do it. It was a way to support a movement against the war in Vietnam, to use the trial as a political platform.
To push the movement further, and the movement, in a sense,
and to
liberates
educate,
you as a lawyer.
Well, it liberates
too, in
me,
some
and
way.
it gives me an opportunity to do something very creative.
Right, exactly. I was going to use that term. Very creative,
It was very creative.
Right.
And it was great. So that was, that provided a basis for it. And that case came out of my working with the law commune. The law commune dissolved, right?
I was going to ask you, so that lasted what?
It lasted,
four or 5
lasted
years?
about 3 years.
3 years.
But if you think about the history of the time, the new left, as did the old left, does a wonderful job of eating itself. Political differences of a minor degree become major debates. I can't work with you anymore, or we can't do that. Running through it all were differences between representing people who were accused of engaging in violent conduct, for example, against the police, assassinating police officers. And there were some within the commune who said that's a political act, that we should represent these folks, and others would say, no, that's not a political act, and we have a very spirited debate. It was also the rise of feminism, and the women in the guild were, the women in the commune were very outspoken, including my wife.
Well, I was going to say, that's also very amazing that you have, that relationship evolved, and
Wow, it was
in the struggles that were going on.
I mean, ultimately,
that's also pretty amazing.
Yeah, all those
Personally.
internal, all those political struggles led to the dissolution of the law commune. Right?
Right.
So what came out of that dissolution was that I went and basically became a private practitioner. I became a solo practitioner, stayed in the same office space, but I did take one case from the commune with me, and that was the handshoe case. Right?
Okay.
Now we had been, because the commune had been working very strongly, and the guild also, because we worked together. The guild was, the Mass Defense Office was representing demonstrators, activists. I can't tell you how many young men and women from the Black Panther Party I represented, because they were just selling a newspaper and they'd get arrested for selling the newspaper. So we go out and represent them and try to take care of that. So we began to see a number of ways that the New York City Police Department was infiltrating organizations, doing surveillance of organizations, targeting individuals for summary punishment, targeting them for arrests and unlawful
Making
detention.
life much more miserable.
Making life miserable. And it turns out there was a whole Red Squad. There was a whole section of the New York City Police Department that
So-called
was
intelligence.
well,
right?
it wasn't called the intelligence.
Wasn't called.
then.
That's
it
today.
was then
right?
was called the Bureau of Special Services.
Bureau of Special Service.
Right.
Literally, extra special.
Well, they were special.
Services.
I mean, they
Yeah,
had
they
responsibilities for, theoretically, for protecting foreign dignitaries that would come to New York for the UN, but they were the political police. They were the thought police. They were the ones that gathered information about your political activity, put you in police files, even though you'd done nothing wrong, right? All you did is open your mouth at a demonstration, you were in the police files. So,
And this continued with whatever mayor was in office, this
well,
sort of underground.
at the time it was John Lindsay.
Lindsay.
Right, but in the course, when we filed this lawsuit in 1971, myself and I recruited the man who became the co-vice president, the co-president of the New York City chapter. That's around the time that I became the president, the first time that I became the president of the New York City chapter. I was then the younger generation. And we had decided, those of us who were the new left, et cetera, the younger generation, we decided, okay, it's time for us to take responsibility for leadership in this organization. And we did. So I was like the first president, the first one of the new generation to agree to become the president. But at the same time I did that, we filed handshoe, which was
There was a distrust also of power, right? Among, or taking power, would you say? I mean, that was one of the things that the new left would argue about, whether to work within the system in this.
Well, I mean,
is
as
how to
lawyers,
do that.
you've got a foot in the system and you got a foot out of the system.
Okay.
If you can operate as a lawyer, then you're operating with a license that they give you. You're operating with a certain amount of freedom to be able to go into court and to do things and to give people legal advice and to help them decide how to do things. On the other hand, you've got another foot out. If you have any political sense, you're also a radical. And you look at the system and you say, my God, this is a system that is designed to protect capital. It's designed to oppress people. It's designed to continue racial divisions and to continue that kind of oppression. Right? So it's kind of funny. But that's kind of where we were.
The nature of the.
It's the nature of doing that.
animal.
So we filed this lawsuit in '71. We
Right.
did lots of discovery, and we found out that the Red Squad had actually been founded in 1909 as the Italian Squad, and had been operating in collecting files and information on people who had not committed crimes, had been doing the infiltrating of organizations, placing undercover agents in In fact, we found out through the Panther 21 case, and it became a major allegation of our civil rights lawsuit, that the Manhattan chapter of the Black Panther Party was founded by the New York City Police Department.
Wow.
The initial founding,
Didn't know
the
that.
initial leadership of the Manhattan chapter of the Black Panther Party was cops, right? And they attracted everybody
Set
else.
it up and
All right? Now, there's something wrong with that.
yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
That's not right. So,
Yeah, yeah.
all right, let's go to court and maybe we can do something about it.
And were you able to?
Well, ultimately, I mean, we were underfunded. We had no ability to do anything. The Corporation Council was putting up, in defending the case, every possible roadblock that could
Form
be up
of
there.
entrapment, right? Or some
Well, it was an entrapment and also a number of other First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, all sorts of violations that we thought
Right.
were there.
Right.
Particularly, but that they were infiltrating and sowing distrust among political organizations. And what's a police department doing with a political police, with a red squad that are designed to think about how to see what people are thinking about? I mean, we know about that in the East German Stasi, right? Where you've got files and dossiers on people's political beliefs. This is America. We don't do that here. Or at least
Presumably.
in theory, we don't do that here. So that's what that lawsuit was about. In 1985, the case got settled. And the way we settled it was with a series of guidelines. Essentially, very practical kind of guidelines that said, okay, police department, if you are investigating political activity, you can't do it. If it's First Amendment activity, you're absolutely prohibited from investigating any aspect of it. You cannot do that. Your detectives can't do it. Your patrolmen can't do it, and you can't keep files and records. On the other hand, if it's criminal activity that you're investigating, that's your job. That's what you're supposed to do. Straight crime is what police investigate. Aha. But
Then that gray area.
where there's a gray area, where there's a mixture of political activity and so-called criminal activity, you can investigate it if you justify your investigation to an outside person. In other words, get a warrant, a form of administrative warrant that lays out specifically, I want to investigate this political person or this political organization.
And give the reasons why.
Because there is criminal conduct occurring.
It makes a lot of sense.
Right? And it was a kind of a
Pretty
practical
fair.
way to do it.
Right.
We created an outside agency called the Handshoe Authority, to which applications were made by the police department to say, we'd like to investigate this, we'd like to put an undercover agent in for that, give us permission to do so. If there was a legal or at least a rational justification that was based on some factual basis that criminal conduct was going to be committed or was about to be committed or had been committed, then we gave the police department the license to do the investigation.
And who might be on the committee, for example?
Well, the Handshoe Authority, you mean, was 2 cops and an outside civilian. Having an outside civilian with authority over the police department was earth-shaking. Right? Nobody had ever done that before.
Even outnumbered 2 to 1.
Even outnumbered 2 to 1.
They had to have what?
They
Unanimous?
didn't have unanimity, but there's a civilian there, and if there's a civilian involved,
They had to watch out.
there's a certain formality that takes place. They can't quite run so rampant. So we set that up, and that became the way the police department operated. What is now the Intelligence Division or the Intelligence Bureau, and they operated that way using the authority, going outside, and we saw over the course of time the number of applications to the authorities to do this kind of investigation dropped off precipitously, right? Because they found out that, hey, people are engaging in political activity, not crime, not criminal activity. So we don't really need to do this. That changed substantially.
That was 1985 now.
This is 85.
And
the
this
rules are enforced, the rules are done.
Okay.
There's the Handshoe authorities in place. There are the Handshoe guidelines, which are part of the court order that settled the case.
And there's certainly a lull in the movement.
Well, there was a lull in the movement. We caught them occasionally breaking the rules, and we'd go back to the court and we'd say, hey, judge, they're breaking the rules. Would you please hold them in contempt or tell them to stop breaking the rules? And there were at least a half a dozen times that we the handshoe lawyers who represented the class of everybody in New York who was involved in political activity. Those were our clients. Pretty good having 8 million people as your clients, I guess. After 9/11, when all of a sudden the police department comes to the realization that, oh my God, every single Muslim in the world, and particularly those that live in the United States, is a potential terrorist. After 9/11, a new head comes into the intelligence division, a guy named David Cohen, who comes straight from the CIA. He spent his entire career at the CIA, where the restrictions of the Constitution were not necessarily anything that had to be paid attention to.
So
He
an
comes
enormous vigor here, and political backing. He enters into the.
He enters in. He becomes the new
fray.
head of the intelligence division
In the police department.
in the police department. He comes into court and says, "Judge, these rules that govern how we collect political information, we can't investigate terrorism with these rules.
And it's all around us, and we're in ultimate
We need
danger
to
here.
investigate terrorism.
Yeah.
These rules
Let us do
are
whatever
no
we need to
good.
do,
They're
yeah.
stopping us from investigating
Right.
terrorism." And you can imagine, in the post 9/11 world, that kind of argument held a lot of sway. And before we got to the point where the judge was going to throw out all the rules, we figured, all right, we'll take watered down rules. So the guidelines got substantially watered down. It made investigations easier to do, and it took away the outside civilian.
Really?
That was the authority from now on, in order to conduct investigations where there had to be a little bit of a piece of paper, some kind of a reason. It had to be approved internally within the police department, right? Which gives them license to do anything they want to do.
Right.
Well, obviously, we found out 8 years later that, of course, they took the license and ran rampant with it, and they were conducting surveillance of the Muslim community. Every single Muslim in the world was a potential terrorist. They were tracking where Muslims ate, slept, played, prayed. Mosques were infiltrated. There were undercover agents in the community. All this came out, and we said, hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong here.
2009?
This is about 2008, 2009, when two intrepid reporters for the Associated Press, Matt Apuzzo and Adam Goldman, basically published documents that had been disclosed to them from people who were clearly inside the police department, who were very dissatisfied with the way the department was going after Muslims. And all this stuff came out, and it was a major, major scandal. And so we went back to court.
The tide began to
The tide comes
shift
back,
a little
and we go back to court, and ultimately basically say the gold guidelines are no good. You know, we need to do something. We have to tighten up the guidelines. And so that has, and here the case, it still exists, right? We're now in 2016. The judge is considering the new guidelines, the new amended guidelines, which are certainly strengthened from the ones that David Cohen got rid of, or that we had to agree to get rid of in 2002.
Right.
And the judge is considering whether to accept and approve what is now a settlement with tighter guidelines.
Still considering this.
Well, the judge is still considering it. My guess is that he's going to approve the settlement, and we will have a new set of guidelines in place. There is a civilian that is appointed by the mayor who is back in the mix of determining when investigations can be commenced or continued. It's not as tight as it was back in the 1985 through 2001 period.
But it's certainly different.
But it's certainly different.
After 2001.
And really what it does is it gives us a platform to complain. It says, if we catch them breaking the rules again, we have the ability to go back to federal court and say, Judge, they're breaking the rules again. It gives us the opportunity to get into their files to find out what they're doing when we get some information that they're doing something that is really wrong.
And also with street gangs, this was going on too with the Latin
Well,
Kings, or that was
street gangs are
that's
are not viewed as political. Certainly you have no First Amendment right to be a Crip or a Blood.
Or a Latin King. Yeah.
Or
even as you try to transform your organization,
if
it's
you're
supposedly
involved in some kind of political activity, if you're
I
doing
see.
something that's
Okay.
political activity, then you come under the auspices of Hanshu.
I see.
If what you're engaged in is a gang that's doing drug dealing or beating up little old ladies, that doesn't cover.
No, I understand. But the attempts by the kings, especially, to supposedly transform themselves, was met with.
Met with the same kind of resistance that
right,
said, sorry,
it's really
you're
yeah.
thugs.
Okay,
Right?
fine. Right, yeah, I
And,
understand.
I mean, which is in many ways the way that every revolutionary movement is treated.
Right. That's what I'm trying to talk about.
The powers
somewhat
that exist
some of the
will
parallels. Yeah.
marginalize everybody who's a revolutionary movement, everybody who's got a great idea. We find it now. That anybody, from the police department's point of view, if you're
Black Lives Matter.
if you're a Black Lives Matter
Right.
activist, then you
Right.
must be anti-police. Or
Yeah,
you might want to kill
Yeah.
police officers because
Exactly.
of your politics that say the police or any criticism of the police.
Right.
That's what comes up nowadays.
Absolutely. And now tell us about some of the cases that are perhaps developing as a result of this sort of attitude.
Well, there have been, my work as a lawyer who represents people involved in demonstrations who get arrested at protests and demonstrations continues. It's something that I've been doing my entire professional career, and I probably will continue to do into the grave, I suppose.
Right.
I mean, I've done
Well,
thousands of represented activists.
I'm so proud to be included in the Stop and Frisk.
I mean, it is representing people who get arrested at political demonstrations is my pleasure.
Right.
I get a tremendous kick out of it. It gives me something to do. It gives me the ability to put activists back on the street, to get them back into doing political activity when the state interferes with their ability to do that. Occasionally, it provides a platform to do a political trial. One is one that's ongoing now. I represent a bunch of folks called the Montrose Nine, right?
Okay.
They got arrested up near Indian Point, the nuclear power facility, which is up in Westchester County. Well,
supposedly it's going to be shut down, or
no, both
Cuomo has
reactors are
talked
now
about-
not licensed. However, there's a
Okay.
little twist on it.
Yeah.
It's a federal, there's a pipeline company that got permission from the federal government to install a brand new high-pressure 42-inch gas pipeline to run fracked gas from the Pennsylvania shale fields through New York up to the East Coast, potentially for export or potentially for use. This pipeline,
How close
which is
has it
being
come?
built, is going to be built about 100 yards away from the nuclear plant.
Really bright.
Right?
Yeah.
Not so bright at all. And no studies were done
Wow.
to basically say there's something that might be a problem here. What if somebody decides, or the pipeline has a problem, because pipelines explode all the time, and you're doing it right next to a nuclear plant, right? There's something not right with that. You have to at least study it. Then the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was told, look, don't approve this until there's some more studies done. No problem, they went right ahead and did it. Anyway, as they were last December, as the company that was building the pipeline was prepared to start and going out and commence their destruction of the forests around so they could lay the infrastructure for building this huge pipeline, 9 people got arrested trying to block the vehicles, the construction vehicles from going out.
Yeah,
and-
they
and doing
literally
it.
lay down and
No, they stood there in the line.
stood in a line.
They stood there in a line on a public sidewalk, but it blocked the traffic. Well, it turns out it caused a traffic jam on Route 209 in Montrose. 9 of them got arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, right, which is a minor offense. It's one that is not even a crime. It's an offense in New York. But they wanted to do a trial that said that they were justified in breaking the law.
I see.
Because of the dangers posed by what they're protesting against, by this new pipeline, how it's sited so close to the nuclear plant, how the fracked gas that it's going to carry is containing environmentally harmful radon and other substances. And
the
that
arrogance of, again, the state.
the arrogance of the state in approving this
Right.
and letting it go on. And of course, it's a major capitalist company.
Right,
This
exactly.
is big energy. Not quite big oil, but it's big gas. So,
So that's,
so we are in the process of doing a political trial. That is, we are defending the disorderly conduct charge with a defense in New York called justification. The justification defense says you can break the law if you do it in a way that qualifies as an emergency, that it's a necessity for you to break the law to prevent a greater harm.
some parallels to the Vietnam
To
cases.
some degree,
To
I
some
suppose.
degree, you could say.
So we're in the midst of doing that trial
wow.
with 9 defendants and putting on a justification case, putting on a necessity defense, which has
Interesting.
rarely been done in environmental cases. I've tried to do it a couple times before, didn't work. Here it's working. I don't know if the judge will accept the defense, but certainly we got a platform
Raising
to-
consciousness, yeah.
to raise consciousness. We put on a nuclear consultant.
I was gonna say,
We put on a town councilman who said, look, the town is opposed to this pipeline. We've done everything we possibly can do
Interesting.
to avoid it. But, you know, but it gives me the opportunity as a lawyer to give the activists an opportunity to carry forward what the action was, what the politics of the action was, and to carry it forward into the courtroom. And that's a great pleasure.
I see
I
that
love
in
doing
your
that.
eyes.
I love
see-
doing that.
I can see that in the love and that just you have, and you're speaking with such great passion. I want to understand better what you're doing also with this case, the IFCO case, and the Viva Palestina. Stina. If you could lay that out a little bit, because the blockade, I've been.
All right, let me put it this way.
Yeah,
I mean,
do some-
I get into this
wanna understand
because
it
one of
better.
the, even though I'm primarily a criminal defense
Yeah,
lawyer,
right.
One of the skills that I've developed over the years is I know about taxes. Right?
Yeah,
and
yeah,
particularly
okay.
tax-exempt
Tax-exempt
organizations,
status. Okay.
501c3s, that if you want to, make a contribution, you get a tax deduction. So I counsel 501c3s, I help create them and give them advice. Well, IFCO, which has been around since the late 60s, or mid-60s, as probably one of the oldest interracial, interreligious civil rights organizations in the country.
National Foundation,
It's a national organization.
national organization.
All right?
The first run and controlled by people of color, is that?
I don't know if it's the first, but it certainly
Okay.
was.
Yeah, at that
You
time,
know, it was
perhaps.
founded, and the executive director for many years was Lucius Walker, the Reverend
Okay.
Walker, who was a minister who had a church in Brooklyn and a family.
Okay.
And was very much of an activist and very close to the Cuban people and the Cuban government for years.
Pastors for Peace.
Pastors
yes?
for Peace. For
Okay.
years, IFCO ran the Cuba Friend Shipment, where they would go around and they'd collect various goods that would be able to be transported to Cuba, or they would fight the blockade in Cuba and transport good, needed goods to the people of Cuba.
And did get through.
And they
At-
got through
at
most of the time.
most
They
of the
ran
time.
into, they had problems with the Office of Foreign Assets Control, with customs that tried to stop them. But they've been running the blockade for 25 years. Anyway,
Okay.
in 2009, IFCO became the North American sponsor for the Viva Palestina convoys. The Viva Palestina convoys were convoys with humanitarian goods, medical goods, medicines, ambulances, educational supplies that were being brought into the occupied territories in Israel as a way to benefit the Palestinian people.
Meaning Gaza.
Gaza.
Gaza, yeah.
And so there were these ships that were Viva Palestina flotillas. And they were, the IFCO was the North American sponsor, so that much money, much tax-exempt money, was collected here.
I get it. Okay.
In the United States and used to buy ambulances, to buy medicine, and to help provide the backing for the convoys that were going to bring all these humanitarian goods into people who really needed them. Two congressmen got wind of this and wrote to the Internal Revenue Service and said, well, how come one of our organizations, one that we give a tax exemption to, is supporting terrorism? They decided that bringing humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people was supporting terrorism. And as a result of those letters, IRS decided to conduct an audit. Right? IFCO, being a tax-exempt organization, had made an application to the federal government years ago saying, look, we're subject to your rules. Give us, we'll let you deduct money, let people deduct money if they contribute to you, just file a tax return. So they conducted an audit. But they didn't just send a regular auditor. They sent a special forensic auditor who came in and basically gave IFCO and every single program that IFCO was involved in a colonoscopy, looking for details about, do you have the right paperwork? Do you have the, how can we trace this check?
Too, some parallels.
And ultimately decided that, this we can't explain how, Viva Palestina, somebody online says, some right-wing idiot said that Viva Palestina was supporting terrorism. Nobody else said that. They adopted this right-wing idiot's line.
Well, possible propaganda from Israel too, maybe.
Presumably. But,
But they weren't, so Hamas was not involved, or no terrorist organization.
Not the Hamas. Hamas was the elected government in the territory, but the recipients of the aid were Palestinian people, not the government.
Humanitarian aid. Right, well, right. So
I was IFCO's lawyer during the course of this audit.
Right.
The forensic auditor discovered all these, my goodness, all this money's come through and it's gone to support Viva Palestina. And we said, of course it did. And then she said, oh, plus also, you've been shipping goods to Cuba? Aren't there regulations against that? And we said, yeah, there's the Office of Foreign Assets Control theoretically licenses people, but we don't take the license. We don't apply for the license. We don't accept the license if it's offered. Humanitarian aid is a faith-based, biblically mandated obligation of a faith-based organization to provide that kind of aid. So
what's the status of the case?
The status of the case is the IRS decided to revoke IFCO's tax exemption.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Then,
so you're appealing that? Or?
Well, we're now in the process of appealing it. We proved pretty much, I think, we've gotten rid of the Viva Palestina problem because we basically provided IRS with a copy of a study that was done by the British office. Viva Palestina was based in Britain.
Yeah.
They did a study to determine whether or not Viva Palestina was supporting terrorism and determined it was not. It's a charity. Right? So we brought that finding. We said, here, look, right? So they backed off on that. Now they're back on to, but you're breaking OFAC regulations. The Office of Foreign Assets Control has regulations that say you can't bring goods into Cuba. Therefore, you're condoning illegal activity, and we decide that your conduct is illegal, therefore your tax exemption is gone. Our position is, wait a minute, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, never told IFCO they were breaking the law. They never sanctioned them. They never gave them a fine. They never threatened them with jail.
So it's a witch hunt.
So how come IRS is enforcing the regulations that are brought by somebody else? We say you can't do that. So we're still mired in the throes of internal revenue appeal. Meanwhile, 6 years later, IFCO's still accepting tax-deductible contributions.
I see.
I've kept them alive all that time.
Wow.
They're a wonderful organization. The executive director is now Gail Walker, who is Lou Walker's daughter. And they're doing wonderful work, including continuing to do the French shipment caravan. And of course, times have changed with Cuba, and the the embargo is not quite what it was during
Absolutely.
the years when
So-
IFCO was doing it.
And Marty, I'm just in awe of the history you've given us, the dedication, the discipline, the changes you've helped bring about. It's still a long struggle, but thank you so much for being here. We've got to do this again. We're just at the tip of the iceberg here,
It is
and some of the things we.
I could probably talk 6 or 7
Well,
hours.
we're going to
with war
hopefully have
stories.
you here. We'd love to have you here again. But for
Thank
right
you.
now, we've got to leave you all. Thank you so very, very much for watching us again on The Radical Imagination. Thank you so much, Marty Stolar. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.